I am the best in the West.
I really want shawarma.
I would take a trip to Canada to go to Shalebi's.
Yeah, it's actually not far. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it's not far. It's like
Or
Michigan.
you seem like you would go to Tahini's.
No, tahinis is not cool.
You were gonna say something inappropriate.
I was gonna say cringe, actually.
It's probably best that you didn't. Thank you for that. Okay, wine for real people.
Yeah,
It's gonna be a long one.
we're talking today about the growing environment.
Growing environment and growing environment. There was another thing.
And the climate of the vineyard.
Yeah,
Talking about vineyard management.
vineyard management. Yeah, that was the other one. Vineyard management. You would think we know.
We know.
Flying by the seat of our pants, but factors that affect the vineyard include things like heat, things like water, things like soil composition. So we're thinking more natural effects of the vineyard, and we'll, I think, briefly throughout the presentation talk about some more man influencing factors like styles of agriculture and things that you could do during harvest. But I'd say the majority of this is
the natural factors.
Exactly.
So in order to have a suitable growing environment, you have to have heat. So that can be either achieved or mitigated through altitude. It helps mitigate warmer regions. If you're higher up off the ground, you have that cooling effect because it's like 1.2 degrees less every 350 feet.
Yep.
And that's why you see people growing in the mountains of Chile.
Yep, Chile.
Big example there. Talking also about latitude.
Yeah.
So you have that range of 30 to 50 degrees, north and south, kind of like this, if this was the world, and you have your little equator.
Or sort of like Mr. Dinosaur is like the world.
Yeah, that's a good model. And then we have ocean currents. So you have the transport of warm or cold water to areas that may be too warm or need the warmth.
And we're really only going to see one warm current bring air or bring water, and we'll touch on what that one current is. Do you know what it is?
It's the Gulf current.
The Gulf Stream.
Yes. Soil composition is also a big thing that affects heat, because if you have a darker soil, it is going to absorb the sunlight much more and retain that warmth. Your fog is a big thing, especially, let's say, in Napa Valley. You have that cloud cover that cools an area that might be a little too warm. Going back to Napa Valley, that fog, that morning fog, protects the grapes from over-ripening due to the excessive sunlight of the region. And then you have, finally, your aspects, whether you're facing the equator. It's really what direction you're facing. You want to be facing north or south. Right. South side. So you have the most east to west, because the sun goes east to west. Right. Or west to east.
And you also have to think about what part of the world that you're on. Are you south or are you north? Are talking about hemispheres, because the direction of which your vineyard faces is dependent on what hemisphere you're in. Because if you're in Chile, instead of being
south facing, you want to be north facing.
Exactly.
And if you're Napa, you want it south facing. If you instead of north facing.
Exactly. So we talked about weather and climate and what the main differences are, I think, in a previous video. So we'll just talk about the different climate classifications and what we're looking at in terms of temperature ranges between those. So cool climate is going to be between 15.6 and anything below that point. That's going to be cool. We'll bring it to moderate, which is really specific, 16.5 to 18.5, just a 2 degrees Celsius range. And remember, we're talking in Celsius since this is a British exam. Good old school in London, our friends across the pond, they have a warm climate outlined as anything between 18.5 degrees and 21, and then hot is anything 21 and above. If we want to jump into the different types of climate.
First, we have our continental climate. This is pretty, I like to describe it almost like landlocked. There's no real influence of the body of water. And as such, here you'll find a great difference in temperatures because there's no water to mitigate the difference in temperatures. There is a risk of frost in the autumn and spring because of the temperature differences. And of course, the closer you get to water, the lower continentality you will have. The next is the maritime climate, which I'll pass it off to you.
So a maritime climate is going to have sort of a shorter and less noticeable difference between their summers and their winters. It's going to be a little bit more stable throughout the seasons. There's going to be that lower sense of continentality, and you're going to have a little bit more rain spread out throughout the year. And there's also in that short amount of in that rain spread, you're going to have a overall decreased amount of I'm sorry, I'm getting my temperatures and my rainfalls confused. Talk to us about temperature.
Temperatures in the maritime climate is going to be low difference. It's going to be pretty much consistent because of that body of water. Water typically it holds the heat of the summer much longer into the winter, and since it takes a long time to heat up and consequently cool down, it brings cold water into the growing season if an area is too hot, for example.
All right, and then I can jump back in with the Mediterranean climate. So you're at most points of the year, especially the summer, in a risk for a drought because the temperatures in this Mediterranean climate are so high. This is generally a region that is closest to the equator, and thus that represents, but may mimic or may literally be in the Mediterranean area of the world, or it at least resembles that sort of style of climate. And typically there is little to no rain during the growing season, and the winters are going to be on the cooler side and a little bit more damp than the summers.
All right, climate of the vineyard. Again, we're going back to altitude. It allows for cooling in warm climates like the mountains of Chile. It also provides air drainage in cool climates. And like I said before, for every 330 feet above sea level, the temperature drops around 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit.
And another climate factor that's going to affect the vineyard is going to be this diurnal range that happens. So this is essentially in reference to a climatic condition in which the mornings and afternoons can be extremely warm, and then the temperature shifts drastically into the night, going into a cooler to colder temperature. So this is going to be very beneficial when we get to our finished product of our wine at the end of our fermentation, because it's going to have more intense aromatics. It's also going to have acidity that is higher or more level, because this cooling allows the acidity to stop that process of falling off as maturation continues during our time leading up to harvest.
And also, because of that acid retention, it helps retain the aromatics of the grape varietal. We're talking again about the cooling effects from the oceans. Like we said, it helps to cool the hot areas, and the one current that is warm in the entire world is the Gulf Stream. The large bodies of water provide moderating influence for temperature, and it holds heat and can release that warmth or cold depending on the time of year. Large bodies of water also encourage cloud cover, which inhibits sunlight. And being by a large body of water can also propagate fog. Like we said earlier, it can help cool down vineyards.
I don't know why we have this picture of the galettes here. It should be down with the soil, but we'll talk about aspect and then we'll get into soil. So aspect, like we said, is essentially just in reference to the direction of your vineyard. And this essentially directs the rays of the sun. I think we have the sun spelled wrong here. It's run.
Well, looking up at our picture of galettes, these kinds of soils will be the best for potentially cold environments. You want to have dark, stony soils, like the galettes of Chateauneuf du Pape, for example. They will both retain heat and reflect heat onto the vine, allowing it better ripening. Go back. And as such, conversely, your light soils will not hold heat that well.
Okay. All right. Wow, this
going into temperature.
So we're going to look at the 4 main seasons and how they affect temperature in the vineyard. So when we're getting into our new year, we'll start in the we'll start in the spring. So your vines in the spring are going to be dormant as they've just gone through winter where there was potentially a freeze. So they're dormant and getting ready for the next season. If you have colder temperatures in your spring, the vines essentially aren't going to know when to wake up and start getting ready for a bud break and start getting ready to photosynthesize and get wrapped into the sort of swing of producing grapes and being alive again. So if you have colder temperatures in the spring, this can affect your bud break and affect the essentially the entire calendar of your growing season. And that can all come from just slightly cooler temperatures in the spring. We'll move on to the summer. Excessive heat is going to be on the opposite side of that range. If you have too much heat, you could have over-ripening. You could have a loss of acidity in your wine. You could have more sugar, so increased alcohol, not something necessarily that you want. If you have the control, you want it to have as much of your sort of handprint on it as possible. So something that's outside of your control, like excessive heat, you want to make sure that you're managing. We'll move on into fall, where you could have an early frost, potentially, depending on some regions, before your harvest. And a frost before harvest just can decimate your potential yield, which you don't want. So you want to make sure that you're forecasting and you're prepared to harvest potentially before a frost if you need to. And then we'll move on to the winter, where you could have a freeze of your vines. This might be good if you're making ice vine, though. You might want a frost in the fall, or you might want a really deep freeze in the winter if you're keeping those grapes on the vines into that season. But for a vineyard that's not doing that, not necessarily beneficial for the vines.
Going back, we're talking about sunlight. So the natural factors that affect sunlight are going to be your latitude, so how far away you are from the equator, your aspect, which way you're facing, and pretty much three main bodies of water that the textbook kind of outlines. You have seas, you have lakes, and you have rivers. And as such, with sunlight, you can have hazards. You can either have too much sunlight, and like we said, that can lead to excessive heat, and you can over-ripen your grapes, lower acidity. Then again, you can have too little, and your plants, your vines need the sunlight to perform photosynthesis in order to grow. So this might really limit your yield or straight up kill your vines.
So we'll then talk about vine density. If you're, depending on the area of the world that you're in and the amount of either rainfall or nutrients in the soil, you might want to sort of shift the way that you're planting in terms of how many plants that you're planting in a given area. So when we're talking about an area that has low water availability, we're going to look to low density planting, which is more in picture on this picture on the left, where it shows that there are at least I'd say maybe a yard, if not more, between each of these vines. Whereas this one is a little bit more regimented, probably more maybe 18 inches between each vine. And you might want to do a low density plant like this when you have that low water availability, because it maximizes the amount of water that each plant can take up from the surrounding soil with less competition for water. You want your vines to be just on the brink of struggle, but you don't want them to be to a point where they can't survive. Where you might have an area with low levels of nutrients in the soil, but a fair amount of rainfall, you actually I sort of thought this was a bit counterintuitive. You want to do high density planting because, like we said, we want the vines to struggle a little bit, but we also want to make sure that native vegetation, if we're looking at invasive species or weeds, aren't taking up some of the competition. If we have a high nutrient availability with sufficient rainfall, you would go back to low density planting with multiple cordons and canes to produce grapes. So you'd be looking in this example to maximize your amount of grape volume and maximize your amount of yield when you get to harvest.
The vine needs water, like we said, and where do we get water? From rain. And we can also, in areas of low water availability, you might have to irrigate.
So 3 ways.
By either drip irrigation, flood irrigation, and sprinkler irrigation.
Just like a suburban town in the summer.
Yeah, sprinklers everywhere. And like sunlight, of course, you have water hazards. You could have too little. and have a drought. You could have too much, and your grapes would actually, the flavors would become diluted with water as the plant absorbs that much water.
Lose concentration.
And also hail. Hail can physically damage the grapes and the vines, possibly reducing your yield.
All right, so then we'll talk about the soil composition. This only has a couple, components of the soil that are really important. It doesn't mention loam, it doesn't mention sand and silt and things like that, but we touch on stones, which are a big part of what makes up soil. So we have the rocks making up a lot of the bulk, especially like the picture that we looked at earlier in Chateauneuf de Pape, where it's very gravelly, it's very stony. You need your humus, and then nutrients, of course, are important for the vine to have as well. The vine needs food. Too much nutrient in the soil might actually be counterintuitive to a successful harvest, because you might have too much vigor. You might have your vines ripening and growing too fast, and they get to a point where they are ripe before the acid levels dropped and before they're ready for harvest at the right sugar level. Too little, and this might mean that your vines are struggling to a point where they're not able to thrive, and you don't want that. You want a little bit of struggle, not a lot. Soil and water, let's see, the best soils are those that have some porosity to them, so that water isn't getting stuck on like a level of clay. It's not overloading the root stock. It's not giving too much water to the berries. You want to make sure that you have adequate drainage so that the water is able to absorb but not get waterlogged.
A big part is vine management, how you manage the vine physically. And the big thing here is that canopy management is sunlight management. Untrellised vines, so those that are not up, they are called bush vines, and they are head trained and spur pruned. They have extra shade because of the foliage that protects from sunburn, too hot. If it gets too hot, the vine itself will shut down. They'll commonly see these on the Isle of Santorini in Greece, because these untrellised vines are grown in a little like basket to protect it from the harsh winds of the island. So you might want to have bush vines if you have high winds or any other effects on the vineyard. We next have trellised vines, and those vines are quite literally trained up on wires, and they are allowed that controls sunlight. Like we said, canopy management is sunlight management. You have air circulation, which reduces the chance of like fungus or bacteria kind of infecting those grapes, because you don't want those like damp, wet, dark conditions. And as such, trellis vines aid in mechanization. So if you have the ability to mechanize, you would want to trellis in order to have that little tractor go right over the trellis.
All right, and that's a nice little photo. Yeah, it's a nice little photo of some trellising, just to show you an example. But as we're talking about this idea of vineyard management, you need to make sure that you are keeping an adequate level of soil nutrients within the soil. We want to have a balance where we're not having too little and we're not having too much. And we talked about the effects of that just a second ago. But you can essentially add in an increased and a supplemental amount of nutrients if you need to, or you could also sort of amend the soil to either take nutrients out by essentially just adding a little bit more soil, and almost like soil dilution in a way. An important part of our vine propagation process, and not necessarily propagation, but getting it ready for the next season, is the idea of pruning. This is removing the unwanted leaves and the unwanted wood and the shoots, so that your vine is able to focus primarily on the buds and the new berries and the new sets of leaves and tendrils for the next season. So what you might do is you might spur prune. You might replace a cane by pruning, and you are generally doing this in the winter or the summer. In the vineyards that I've been to, it's generally during the winter, but this can change from vineyard to vineyard.
In order to use a trellis, you have to train the vine. The vine has tendrils that allow it to grow and grab onto things and whatnot. And you can quite literally mold the vine and the wood to the required shape of the trellis. And that's how we achieve the trellis. As such, these trellises themselves are wooden structures, and they have wires that run through them that the grapes are trained upon, and these support the vines up.
Right. I think we talked about vine density.
We talked about vine density.
So we can move on to yield and quality. So when we have high levels of heat, sunlight, and nutrients, we have a increased potential for higher quality fruits with higher yields. Because we have this trifecta, the grapes are able to ripen to the point where they need to. They're able to sort of be in the correct conditions for the correct amount of time. There's no added stress of too much heat, or there's no added stress of not enough nutrients. So I'm like ill and not able to produce as much. I start to shut down as the vine. That's the sweet spot of really high quality wine production. These regions are known for their soil quality. They're known for their moderate amounts of sunlight and their moderate amounts of heat. That's why you have places, say the Crus of Bordeaux, they're in perfect areas for production. Low levels of sunlight, heat, and nutrients, there's only potential for slightly lower yields of high quality fruit. So you don't have this increase for large quantities like we do when we have the trifecta met.
All right, some risks for the vineyard now. We talk about pests and disease. The big thing that you want to control pests and disease is that it can limit the vine's photosynthetic capabilities, and as such, it can damage and destroy fruits or even the vine itself. So you have to treat and manage these diseases and pests. We talked about rootstocks in an earlier episode about plant grafting and how that can protect against phylloxera, a pest. You might have physical barriers of, let's say, like deer are coming in and like eating your stuff. There are chemical sprays, and of course, back to canopy management, not promoting a like fungal infection by keeping them trellised. Some pests include nematodes, which are like parasitic little worms, birds, mammals, and phylloxera, little mites that eat the rootstock of Vitis vinifera, but do not eat the rootstock of Vitis lambrusco.
They just can't handle it.
They just can't handle it.
And that's why you'll see a lot of lambrusca graftings with vinifera. There are also potential for viruses as well as bacterial diseases for the vines as well. We'll then talk about the more
human influence on the vineyard.
Yeah. Human influences. So you have some options for the way that you're going to perform your agriculture in the vineyard. You could do a conventional agriculture, which is a really not antiquated yet, but it's more traditional. It's sort of a mid-20th century approach to agriculture where you're using chemicals and you're using fertilizers as a way to prevent pests and make sure that you have the proper amount of nutrients in your vines. You'll see in the modern era, there's a movement away from this idea of conventional agriculture because you have grape growers and legislators and most of all consumers wanting a decreased amount of environmental impact on their wines. So we really have three main ways of consciously producing your wines and your grapes through agricultural practices: sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture, and interestingly enough, we'll talk about biodynamic agriculture.
So starting with sustainable agriculture, this kind of increases in the amount of legislation involved as we go, and sustainable agriculture is the baseline, the base of this little pyramid. So man-made chemicals are restricted, but they are not prohibited in sustainable agriculture. And winemakers are encouraged to have the knowledge of the vines, the weather, and the pests of the area, and are encouraged to prevent outbreaks of these before they occur. It's pretty much, I summarize it as being conscious-minded, being conscious of the vineyard and the land, the grapes, everything. And as such, sustainable agriculture also puts a focus on what's called IPM.
Yep. So integrated pest management, I can touch on. It's a very common technique in sustainable agriculture of any kind, but in grape growing, it could mean that you're using non-conventional methods to prevent pests from coming into your agricultural area. So this might be having predators for, say, mammals or things like phylloxera or nematodes around the area, or plants that are naturally going to attract those predators so that they then feast on these pests that are bothering your vines. That's an example of an easy way to use a non-chemical factor to manage pests in the vineyard. And a biodiversity is really essential when we finish talking about sustainable agriculture, which feeds right into organic agriculture, which takes these same principles and just puts a little bit more emphasis on some of these changes that you're making. So you're using an extremely small amount of traditional chemicals, and that can change from place to place depending on the local ordinances and what sort of sustainable or what sort of organic certification you're applying for. Of which there are certifications that you need. If you want to be organic, you do have to have a certification of you being certified organic. And in order to do this, not only do you have to meet an intense amount of regulations and levels of, nutrient levels and fertilizer levels and chemical levels in your soils, you have to put your vineyard through a conversion process that sort of shifts your organic production processes into more organic minded operations. So that's a time commitment for growers, but also comes with some name reputation with the organic label. You may get some more revenue from that in terms of your customer base. You also might be able to charge more.
Factors that affect the price of wine. Moving on to biodynamic agriculture, this incorporates cosmology and philosophy to the organic practices. As such, vineyards that follow a biodynamic cycle adapt their growing cycle to the alignments of the moon, planet, and stars, believing that the land itself is connected to these celestial bodies, and as such will promote better grape growth. As such, they make what's called preparations, which fertilize soil, wards off pests, and treat diseases. I'm pretty sure actually it's just a cow horn. So you have a hollowed out cow horn, and you stuff it full of manure, and you bury it in the ground on a certain day, and that is to promote to fertilize the soil. And as such, certification bodies do exist if you want to put biodynamic on your bottle.
So then we'll finish by talking about another man-made influence or man-related factor on the vineyard. That's when we get around to harvesting. So you have two main harvesting options. One's a little bit more expensive than the other, but they're both expensive for different reasons depending on how you're looking at it. We'll talk about machine harvesting first, which is the most expensive way that you can harvest if you're getting your machinery up front. The startup costs and the front end cost for getting machinery to harvest is not cheap. It's extremely expensive, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Same as like farming equipment, more expensive than one would think. But if you're in, say, a village, or you're in a commune, or you're, buddies with your neighboring winemaker, you might be able to share equipment or rent out equipment depending on what the schedules of your, harvests are. If they're lining up, if you're 1 week past, your buddy next door, he might be able to borrow his equipment or her equipment after they're done and harvest for a little bit cheaper than buying your actual equipment. But a caveat to this, your vineyard has to be flat, as the machines, or at least most of them, not any that I've seen, aren't able to harvest on inclines. So that's something that you need to keep an eye out for. We'll then talk about hand harvesting, which is a little bit more invasive, but also could be expensive depending on your labor force.
Yeah, so hand harvesting typically will have a higher labor cost because you're actually paying a bunch of people to go out into your vineyard and pick grapes by hand. As such, it's much more selective. The big thing about machine harvesting is that it takes everything. grapes that have been damaged, grapes that are unripe. But with hand harvesting, you have that ability to physically look at the grapes and pick the good ones to bring them back into the winery. As such, with hand harvesting, you got to really decide when to harvest based on either sugar content, the color of the grapes, the texture, and the taste. Because actually tasting the grapes is one way of
it's an old school way.
It's an old school way of knowing whether or not the grapes are ripe.
I think there were some winemakers that would bite the grape, not taste it. They would taste it, but not for. They wouldn't just go based on how the taste and the acid and the sugar was. They'd go based on the look to see how the color of the inside of the grapes and how the seeds were changing. Because when the seeds, I think, change from, I think it's black to green.
I think that's green to black.
Green to black. That was a sign that the grapes are ready. Like in that moment, they're ready. That was vineyard management, and
30 minutes later.
I hope you.
That was awesome.
I hope you liked it.
Keep it real. Wine for real people. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye. Oh my God, we're still recording.
Are we?